just for organising this event, but for all your work on the Civil Society Commission, driving the conversations on how civil society can thrive in this country. I must say, it is quite nice to be among civil society. You don't get much of that in Westminster. And it's really good to be here at St John's, Waterloo. What a fantastic building this is. As you probably know, during the Second World War, this church was bombed and this room was completely destroyed. But in the crypt that's down below us, there are 150 people hiding, and all of them survived. So it's an incredible story behind this building. And after the war, of course, it was rebuilt, and a Labour government recognised that this country had to work for the people who had been through so much. And you all know what happened next. They set up the NHS, the welfare state. They transformed this country so that it could face the future. But long before the government was involved, it was people, faith groups and organisations like you who supported people through sickness, who educated our children, who protected people living in poverty, because it's always been people like you who've recognised the dignity of every single person. And that's the history and the heart of the Labour Party too. Community organisers, campaigners and charitable movements who fought for people to live better lives in a better country. When the Labour government set up the welfare state, they were influenced by people like William Beveridge, who recognised that the government couldn't and shouldn't do everything by themselves, and that civil society and faith groups play a unique and vital role in this country, building the relationships and the shared values that shape our national life. And we can still see today what partnership can achieve. Look at Young Futures hubs to support vulnerable teenagers, free breakfast clubs in primary school, speech and language therapy for young people. These are areas where civil society spoke out and Labour listened, because we know it's people on the ground, people with skin in the game, who understand the problems best and have the best answers. You are the glue that bridges the gaps and binds government, business and communities together. And you reach into the places that the public and private sector can't, creating the space, literally, for people to come together in church halls, community centres, museums, leisure centres, you name it, all around the country, as well as creating the space for conversations and campaigns that change lives. But let's be honest, for too long, your voice has been ignored between the shouts of the market and the state. One Conservative Prime Minister said there was no such thing as society. And then we watched individualism run rampant. Cameron talked about the big society, a great idea in principle. But when austerity kicked in, we ended up with the poor society. So now we need a new vision for a new era, a renewed social contract, a new focus on those who build the bonds that connect us, the communities that nurture us, and the local institutions that support us. A society of service. Because when I look around, 14 years of chaos and crisis have pushed people to the brink, stretched charities like yours beyond their limits, and damaged the social fabric that ties us together. And look, I'm not here to talk about the Tories today, but I know over the last 14 years, you've carried the burdens of their failure. The Trussell Trust expected to provide more than 1 million emergency food parcels this winter. I know that during the pandemic, you saved lives. I think of the vaccination clinics I visited in places of worship. I know that during a decade of division, you held communities together, like the neighbourhood groups who knocked on doors during COVID, checking in on people they didn't even know, just to make sure they were all right. And instead of seeing this as a model that should inspire us and drive us forward, the Tories seem set on sabotaging civil society to save their own skins. They've got themselves so tangled up in culture wars of their own making that instead of working with Royal National Lifeboat Institution, an organisation the late Queen was patron of for 70 years, to find real solutions to stop the small boats, their rhetoric has helped demonise them. Instead of working with the National Trust, so more people can learn about and celebrate the culture and our history, they've managed to demean their work. In its desperation to cling on to power at all cost, the Tory party is undertaking a kind of weird McCarthyism, trying to find woke agendas in the very civic institutions they once regarded with respect. Let me tell you, waging a war on the proud spirit of service in this country isn't leadership. It's desperate, it's divisive, it's damaging. And it comes to something when the Tories are at war with the National Trust. That's what happens when politics of self-preservation prevail over commitment to service. People who are getting on with things that actually matter, saving lives, supporting those in need, serving others, get caught in the crosshairs of division and distraction. So the relationship between government and civil society needs a reset. Because you should feel that you can speak up on behalf of the people you serve without fear. Call out injustice where you see it. Continue to push us all to be and to do better. And there are two stories of the past 14 years, aren't there? There's a story we hear in the news every single day: crisis, cronyism, chaos, a government that has stoked division for its own ends, seen the privilege of service as an opportunity for self-advancement. And then there's the other story, the story that gives me hope, the story of ordinary people in this country doing what our government hasn't done. Looking out for each other, looking after one another. The story of charities that have met the needs of local people, like Compassion in Action. I met the founder, Pam, a couple of weeks ago, and she told me how it started. Initially as a food bank, and now as a hub for the local community, providing food, accommodation and training for those who need it. Everywhere I go, I hear stories of courage, compassion, and community. Stories of service that could fill every paper in the country. But civil society is not just a nice news story in a local paper, something we can feel warm and fluffy about. It's essential if we're going to get our economy back on track and achieve the highest sustained growth in the G7. Look at the thousands of charities across the UK supporting people back into work. The organisations facilitating local regeneration, or providing more than 6 million volunteering opportunities and employing almost 1 million people. And look, you should not have to clean up the mess your government created. But it is to your credit and to the credit of this country that you have always held up your end of the social contract. So, to those of you in this room and to the people and organisations across the UK whose work so often goes unsung, I want to say thank you. Thank you for all that you've done. But imagine for a moment Imagine a government committed to working with people, not doing things to people. Imagine if we could turn our attention from firefighting every day to the long-term renewal this country needs. That's our pledge to you, that if we're privileged to be elected to serve this year, we will work with you on our missions for a decade of national renewal. Now, every word of that phrase is important. A decade, because, realistically, that is how long it will take. And civil society knows better than anyone that lasting change takes longer than an election cycle. National, because this will need every one of us to play our part. Labour will not write off the contribution of civil society. We know that you are often the link between the local and the national. And finally, renewal. Because we don't just want to tinker with the symptoms of this government's failure. We want to tackle the causes so that this country is fit to face the future. And I want today to mark an important milestone towards implementing an action plan on how, together, a future Labour government would work with civil society for a society of service. Because we will work with you on every single one of Labour's missions. Getting the NHS back on its feet, tearing down barriers to opportunity, growing the economy in all parts of the country, getting to clean power by 2030, and making our streets safe. Mission-led government is about partnership, about devolving power to communities, setting long-term targets and working with people to get there, giving people the responsibility they deserve and the support that they need. We don't want to crowd out the social entrepreneurs. We want to encourage them. We want to harness civil society as one of the three key engines for renewal, working alongside the public and private sectors. Take crime, for example. When I was this country's chief prosecutor, the director of public prosecutions, I fought for a justice system that worked for people. But it isn't working for anyone under the Tories, is it? I've sat with too many parents who've lost their child to a knife crime. I've heard too many horrifying tales of domestic abuse from women who never got the justice they deserved. Later this week, I'll be on the road talking to people about Labour's plan to tackle knife crime, our plan to halve violence against women and girls. Yes, it's ambitious, but it's necessary. And we know we will need to partner with organisations on the ground to make this a reality. I've delivered on this before. We'll do it again, together. With organisations like Wolverhampton Wrestling Club. I've been there twice and I think there's a representative here today. They mentor vulnerable children and teach them sport. Or Women's Aid, supporting victims of domestic violence. My government won't accept business as usual. We can't. Halving violence against women and girls is incredibly difficult. You all know that. I know that from the 5 years I spent as Director of Public Prosecutions, working with many organisations, including some of the organisations in this room. No government or opposition has ever committed to this before, halving violence against women and girls. So we will need to work in new ways with a steely determination. But we want you to push new ideas on policies that will work for the people of Britain, rather than picking up the pieces of bad policies. So, on vital issues that will support our missions, like child poverty, we will bring together experts, including people in this room, to look at every cause and contributor to child poverty, so we can offer long-term strategic solutions. This is a politics that focuses on the issues people really care about, not that seeks to distract people from the problems the government has created. A politics that brings people together to work for the common good, not seeking to divide and demonise a common enemy. A politics that serves others, because the biggest problem we have is the erosion of trust in politics and politicians. The exhaustion people feel at the daily soap opera the government seems to think public life should be about. We need to restore the foundations of trust, fairness, and respect in our national life. Because politics can influence people's attitudes. It can encourage us to serve others, to make sacrifices for others. Or it can undermine the sense of community, the commitment to each other that's at the heart of civil society. And that's what I worry we've seen. That people who've made sacrifices, worked hard, played by the rules, feel as though the people in charge have been laughing at them for doing the right thing. Feel as though people who break the rules and take what they can are rewarded, while working people, people doing the right thing, get nothing to show for it. In a society of service, doing the right thing should be rewarded. Working hard should pay off for people, and building caring, compassionate communities should make our country stronger, more prosperous, fairer for everyone. If you serve others, this country should serve you. This is a once-in-a-generation chance, a mission-led government, a partnership between government and civil society. Our door is open. We will welcome anyone who wants to make our national life better, to take their place at the table, to shape the future with us. And I'll be frank with you, it isn't just an invitation to you, it's an ask, because this is an opportunity for hope, a chance to protect those who are vulnerable, like this building did, to rebuild our country, just like this church was rebuilt, to create a society of service for a decade of national renewal, to get Britain's future back. Thank you very much.
Sir Keir Starmer there wrapping up his comments and talking about the way that he says Labour listens to civil society and that charities like those who we're addressing are able to reach into spaces that the government cannot. He claimed that under the Conservatives, individualism has run riot. The politics of self-preservation has overtaken those of service, and said that Labour wants to create a society of service. Let's bring in Serena Barker-Singh, who's been watching that at the same time. And Serena, beforehand I was talking to Kay, wondering whether this would create a very clear policy wedge for Labour. Maybe it's created a bit of a policy wedge. Is it one that's going to be seen as hugely significant in the year ahead?
Well, I think their idea was that they wanted a big, bold idea from the Labour leader. Today we got a sense of a big picture, at least. So he said he wanted a new social contract, that people shouldn't and couldn't be doing things, everything's by themselves, and praising initiatives like young future hubs, free breakfast clubs, speech and language therapy for young people, saying that where people spoke out, Labour listened. Now, as you say, they want to create a government of society of service and embrace charities and civic institutions, which they say the Conservatives have waged a war on. And what that means essentially is that they're saying Labour will work with partnerships and community groups who are the glue that bridge the gaps among what they call a frayed social fabric. Now, it's sort of reminiscent of 2010 politics, so that's Cameron's Big Society, which Keir Starmer actually did reference in his speech. He said it was a great idea in principle, but actually when austerity kicked in, we got the Poor Society. And essentially that was an initiative where bodies and charities would step in where the state couldn't quite. So Keir Starmer's not exactly saying that today. They're saying that government and business partnerships could work together instead. Also, interestingly, he sort of tipped actively into the culture war debate. He defended institutions like the National Trust, RNLI, institutions that he says have been heavily criticised by the right. So it's quite rare for him to make an intervention this way, and interesting to see how far he'll venture into this as the days come on. And especially interesting to see how the Conservatives will respond to this. Keir Starmer was squarely attacking them, saying the culture war is desperate, damaging and divisive.
Serena, thanks so much for that. Serena Barker-Singh is going to monitor that Q&A and bring us any highlights from it later in the show. But for now, here on Sky News Today, we're going to take a very quick break. When we come back, the clean-up from Storm Aisha begins. We'll get the latest from across the country. We'll also be discussing why a new Hindu temple in India is so controversial, and we'll get more reaction to that speech from Sir Keir Starmer from a guest joining us a little bit later.
We all live in an uncertain world. From global conflict and crises to moments full of hope and unity. We'll take you to the heart of the story and help you understand the world around us. Join me, Yalda Hakim, on my new show, The World, on Sky News.
Reliably Labour to want to improve your country. But if you believe in this project, what we're trying to build is big enough for you. So that it's broader than narrow politics. And because it's broader than narrow politics, I hope it will therefore be enduring in the sense of being capable of being sustained over 5 or 10 years. So that's the invitation. That's where we need most to work with you, and the closer we can work from here on in, the better, I think. I mean, in many ways, we probably should have had this conversation a year ago, but it's taken time to develop the idea of a decade of national renewal, and to set out the missions, in terms of the driving purpose of them.
I'm going to come to a few questions from the audience in a moment, but I had just one more question. What we've seen in moments of crisis, and there have been many in this country over the last few years, is time and time again we've seen civil society stepping up. In the pandemic, in the cost of living crisis, last night there was a storm. I know that around the country there will be charities and community groups stepping up to help communities. And there's that real sense of how civil society supports the resilience of society as a whole in those moments of crisis. But I think one of the conversations we've been having as a sector recently is how, in order for us to be there as civil society in those moments of crisis, society needs to support our resilience as well. And I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
No, we touched on this in brief comments we had earlier today, because I think that's important. I mean, you don't need me to tell you that you're stretched beyond your limits almost everywhere. And you are trying to provide the support with probably less resource than you've ever had before to provide it. And that has to be addressed as part of what we do going forward if we're making a big ask of you. We also need to get a mindset change here as well. I mean, the storm and the floods are an example of sticking plaster politics in many ways. I went up to see a flooded area just 2 or 3 weeks ago now, after the last storm. And you'll have all, or many of you will have done this. To go into people's homes that have been flooded is just so demoralising, because it stinks, it's wet, it's filthy water, there's all their possessions, these are personal things to them. It's not an office or anything, it's their personal lives that have been turned upside down. There will be the familiar story of them having to move out, trying to heat it, and then the familiar story, at least a third of them won't have insurance because they didn't have enough money, or the premium went up because it's already been flooded once. And we've got to stop going out after the storm to try to help people rebuild their lives. We've got to get ahead of the storm and put the resilience in place first. And so working with you, not just on the response to storms and flooding or whatever it may be, but on the resilience that needs to go to stop that in the first place, or to mitigate that in the first place, is hugely, hugely important. And so there's a strong preventative theme running through everything that we want to do. We launched did work on our health mission the week before last. I did this up in the northwest, in Manchester and Liverpool and Bury. And this is for a health service that's not just back on its feet, but fit for the future. If that's going to happen, we need to change the model. The model needs to be preventative rather than after the event sickness service. And one of the things that reinforced that to me, I was in Alderhay Hospital, which some of you will have been. It's an absolutely brilliant children's hospital just on the outskirts of Liverpool, and it is humbling. If ever you think you're having a hard day, just go into that hospital or Great Ormond Street in my constituency, and it's very humbling. And I was on the ward with a brilliant team who were doing heart surgery for babies. This is incredible. You look at the baby, it's almost impossible to imagine how you could do heart surgery. And it just actually awe-inspiring to see. And so you have this emotion of almost being overcome with humility and awe. And then for me, mixed with a bitter anger, when I learned that more children are admitted to Alderhay Hospital to have their teeth taken out because of tooth decay between the ages of 6 to 10 than anything else. So those brilliant, dedicated staff are spending their time taking teeth out of children who've got decaying teeth because we haven't got ahead of prevention, which is why I said, amongst other things, we need supervised toothbrushing for children, and we got a lot of stuff about the nanny state, etc., etc. I'm sorry, if you're asking brilliant staff in Alderhay to take teeth out, then somebody's got the priorities wrong in terms of the preventative work that we need to do. And this is where we can work, I hope, with you, because you will know better than most the preventative steps that need to be taken. Of course you need the support after the event, but you do need the preventative steps as well.
Thank you. So we are very tight for time, but I've just got time for 2 audience questions. The first is from Antal Rana, who's the CEO at Keir Support Services. Antal, can I get you to stand up so that we can get a mic to you?
Thank you. Don't know if that's working, yes?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I've actually heard some really good comments today, and we are one of those small charities, or a very small team, and we've heard about funding today as well. So my question to you is, it's welcome to see Labour's ambition to halve violence against women and girls in the next decade when you're in government. To do this, it will first be essential to improve the dire funding situation to specialist support services, including those led by and for black and minoritised women like us, Keir Support Services. So what action will you take to fund our sector and to change the wasteful, ineffective procurement and competitive tendering processes that discriminate against by and for organisations? And secondly, we'll need a radical change in preventing VOG with children and young people. A third of young women recently surveyed by Women's Aid found relationships and sex education in schools rushed and awkward. Will you properly fund relationship, sex and health education and work with experts to deliver a whole school approach to ending violence and abuse in schools?
Thank you very much. And as you know very well, Rachel Reeves is not permitting even me to make funding commitments on stage at events like this, but the point you make is very important about the funding structures and ensuring that some of the groups there that do vital work are supported in doing that work, and that's what a partnership with you is all about, as far as I'm concerned. On your wider issue about what we have to do with young people at school, I think that's a big part of it. I think particularly boys being taught on talking more openly about relationships is really, really important in this. I mean, halving violence against women and girls is a really, really tough ask. This, you know, when people say you've not got any ambition, you're not being bold, there's no distinction between you and the Tories, you couldn't be more wrong. Halving violence against women and girls. When I was doing it as Director of Public Prosecutions for 5 years, it was really hard. And we were just working on the conviction rates and also trying to make sure criminal justice was somewhere where people could feel they could come forward. So halving it is huge. Got to start, again, with the preventative stuff, the talking that goes on, the teaching that goes on in schools. As I left the job of Director of Public Prosecutions, where we had made some real progress on violence against women and girls, I read this report, I can't remember who published it now, which was so depressing, because it suggested that 16 to 19-year-old girls were at the greatest risk of domestic abuse. And it almost sort of knocked me over that whilst I thought some progress was being made, here waiting in the wings was the next generation of, you know, girls, young women who are being subjected to the very thing that we're trying to drive down. So this has got to be it's a big project. It's got to draw on the resource of you and your organisation and others. And we've got to have strategic thinking about how we tackle it, you know, at the preventative stage. It's all very well having convictions, etc., and we do need that because the number of people who come forward is so low, and the conviction rate isn't where it needs to be. But that's the after the event. That's what are you going to do once it's happened. And we all know that, you know, for every one case that might get to a criminal court, there's 9 that never got off the ground. But the preventative stuff in schools is hugely, hugely important. And my boy is 15. I can see why it's so important that, you know, at his school they talk about these things.
Thank you. One last question from Mark Hodgkinson, who's the CEO at Scope. Mark, if you can stand up. Very good.
Thank you. So Keir, my question is very much about hopefully tearing down barriers and creating greater economic benefit as a result. So there are 1 million disabled people in the UK who are of working age, want to work, able to work, and currently not in work. There are also around 1 million vacancies at the moment and skill shortages in the UK. The disability employment gap has sat at 30% for the last 10 years. So there's been no long-term vision for change. So welcomed your view about a long-term vision. But my question to you is, there's also, an economic benefit of, if you halve that gap, of £15 billion to the Treasury in terms of the benefits that flow. So my question is, really simply, what would you do to realise the potential that's on offer there?
Firstly, I think it's a really important point, because the inability for us to create the conditions and the structures for those with disabilities to work has been shockingly neglected for many, many years, and therefore the gap is getting worse, not better. It is hugely beneficial for the individuals who want to work, want to have there is a pride and a respect in work that is different to the support you receive if you're not working. It's not just a question of where the money comes from, it's about dignity and respect. So it's a very important issue of well-being for the individual, very important for the economy, because all the time we've got people who are not working, who want to work and could be in work. We've got a problem with our economy, and we've had a flat economy with very little growth for 14 years, which means we haven't had the money for our public services. You get into a vicious cycle. So I do think there are things, firstly, we need to recognise that. Two, to have a strategy to deal with it. I think there are individual rights that we can put in place. So we've got a new deal for working people, which we've crafted, which is about inclusion and dignity and respect at work and the adjustments that need to be made. And then there are one or two pilots that I think are worth looking at. In my constituency, we've got a Deaf City Hub, which is all about ensuring we've got inclusion for people who are deaf. So there are examples, I think, of areas where it's obvious that this can be done. So we need to work with you and others to make sure that strategy is hammered out. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We could go on for ages, but on all sides, time is pressing. So thank you very much for those questions. Thank you so much, Sir Keir, for your speech and for engaging in dialogue with us. Please join me in a round of applause.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Thank you. See you later.